The silence was overwhelming, louder than any sound I'd ever experienced. I had never truly grasped how much life a home could hold until all that warmth was gone. The distant echoes of joy, the soft buzz of a television left running in the background, the comforting rhythm of footsteps across the wooden floor, all of it had vanished without a trace. In its place lingered an empty void, a space that no longer felt like it belonged to me. Standing at the threshold, I gazed into the dimly illuminated living room. Everything remained exactly where we had left it. Her perfume still floated faintly in the air, a ghost of presence that only deepened the contrast. Something was off, deeply off. Lorna hadn't come back yet. Tonight was her bachelorette celebration, the final festivity before we were supposed to step into marriage, bound together by promises and dreams. I should have felt joy for her, even a bit of anticipation. But instead, I stood in this house we had crafted together, consumed by a silence so profound that it rang in my ears. I finally stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me. The sound of the lock snapping into place had a strange sense of finality. My eyes drifted toward the staircase, the familiar path leading to the bedroom we once shared. That space had always been a haven. Now, it felt foreign, even threatening. Each step toward it felt heavier than the last. I didn't know what I expected to feel once I crossed the threshold of that room, but when I saw the small envelope sitting neatly atop the dresser, my stomach twisted with unease. It was addressed to her. She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. While she had been out enjoying what she called her last night of freedom, I had spent weeks uncovering a truth that chilled me to my core, a truth that tore apart every illusion I'd held about her. My fingers brushed over the edges of the envelope. Inside were words she never anticipated receiving. She would return soon, still glowing with the night's festivities, only to find the home she knew stripped of its comfort and familiarity. She would step into a place that no longer welcomed her. And when she read that letter, the pieces would fall into place. I kept my eyes on the envelope, my fingertips resting on it as if it could somehow absorb the weight it held. It felt heavier than it should, maybe because of everything it represented. Truth, sorrow, and an ending I never wanted but could no longer avoid. I had rewritten those words over and over, searching for a way to soften the blow, but no version of the letter could make this easier. She would arrive any minute now. I imagined her walking through the door, heels tapping lightly against the floor, her voice carrying the excitement of the evening as she called out for me. She'd think I was upstairs waiting for her, maybe with some late-night snacks and a smile. She had no idea what was actually waiting for her. My thoughts slipped backward, tracing the steps that led me here. It all began as something small, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. There was a pause in her voice when she talked about the bachelorette party, a glance at her phone that lingered too long, a subtle flick of her fingers as she quickly cleared a notification. I told myself it was nothing. I wanted to believe that. But the small things started adding up. Unreturned messages. Late nights with vague explanations. A change in her eyes when she looked at me. Once you notice the cracks, you can't pretend they're not there. She hadn't told me where the party was, only mentioned that her friends were planning a surprise. But I wasn't naive. I started looking for answers. At first, I thought I was overthinking. I even hoped I was wrong. But when I parked across from that rented house and looked through the window, all my hope turned to ash. That wasn't the party she had described, not even close. I watched her through the glass, laughing in a way I hadn't seen in years, free, wild, untethered. But she wasn't with the group of women she had claimed. There were no silly games or shared memories. She was with another man. At first, I didn't recognize him, just some stranger who seemed far too familiar with her. His hands moved across her like they belonged there, like it wasn't their first time. Then she leaned in and kissed him. Not a quick, confused gesture. It was intentional, confident, like she had forgotten everything we had. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I didn't explode. I didn't break down. I just felt a cold, sharp clarity. I sat there, watching through the windshield for what felt like an eternity, waiting to snap out of this nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. And by the time she climbed into that car, her hair a mess and her lipstick faded, my decision had already been made. I came home before her. I wanted her to step into the wreckage of what she'd done. I wanted her to feel that deep, unsettling jolt in her chest, the kind of creeping unease that grows slowly when you realize something is terribly wrong. I wanted her to understand that I knew everything. So I packed up my things, left my key on the counter, and wrote a letter. Now, as I stood in the dim light of the bedroom, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Any moment now, she'd walk through that door, and the reality she believed in, the life she thought she had, would fall apart the instant she read those words. There was no need for vengeance. I didn't have to shout or break anything. I just needed to disappear. And when she stood there alone, surrounded by the consequences of her own choices, only then would she truly grasp what she had thrown away. The house felt heavy with silence. Not the kind of quiet that wraps around two people who understand each other without speaking, but the stifling kind that wraps around your chest and tells you something is deeply wrong. I didn't have to wait long. The low hum of a car pulling into the driveway pierced through the stillness, followed by the sharp click of high heels on pavement. My stomach twisted, not from second thoughts, but from the strange finality of it all. There was no sorrow, only the surreal feeling of witnessing the end of something that should have ended a long time ago. The lock turned. She was back. I didn't need to see her to know exactly how she looked at that moment. I could picture it in full detail. Her dress slightly creased after hours at the party, makeup clinging on but beginning to fade. The air around her would carry the scent of perfume, alcohol, and something else, something she believed I'd never notice. But this time, everything was different. She would step inside expecting familiarity, but instead, she'd be greeted by absence. The shoes that usually sat by the entrance, gone. The jacket that always hung on the hook, missing. The small signs that made a house feel shared, now erased. I could see it clearly in my mind. The way she'd hesitate, the pause in her steps as she entered a space that suddenly felt foreign. Even if she managed to smile, it would falter. Maybe at first, she'd convince herself I was already asleep, that nothing was wrong, that it was just a quiet night. But reality would catch up to her soon enough. I listened to the echo of her heels on the hardwood floor. Each step was slow, deliberate. She called my name, her voice carrying a tired edge, still expecting an answer. But the house offered none. She moved from room to room, her pace quickening, her breathing shifting just slightly. I could almost hear her thoughts racing. Where is he? Why is it so quiet? And then, it happened. The bedroom door creaked open. I could almost hear the sharp breath she drew in. She saw it, the letter. I had left it on her dresser, placed deliberately so she wouldn't miss it. Right beside it lay something far more telling. Her engagement ring, now nothing more than a cold, silent object. She didn't move at first. Then came the faint sound of paper as she reached for the envelope, her hands hesitating at the seal. I imagined the wave of realization washing over her, slow but undeniable. She didn't yet know how much I had uncovered, but she was about to. Morna's fingers trembled as she clutched the envelope. I doubted she even realized it. The mind tends to deceive us when we're not ready for the truth. Perhaps she thought it was a sweet note, something affectionate I had left behind to surprise her. Maybe she believed it was a joke, a playful message about her evening out. Something light, something that wouldn't unravel her world. But then she saw the ring. I had set it beside the letter with care, positioned just right, so the soft glow from the lamp made it shimmer, enough to catch her eye. It wasn't a symbol of love anymore. It wasn't a promise for the future. It was a statement. A soft gasp escaped her lips. She understood. I pictured her chest tightening, her pulse thudding too loudly in her ears. Her world had tilted, but she wasn't ready to let it crash, at least, not yet. That's the nature of betrayal. It doesn't become real until the walls come down. She broke the seal of the envelope, slowly and deliberately, as though unsure whether she truly wanted to face what lay inside. My words were written clearly, without emotion. No pleading, no accusations, no bitterness. Just the truth, undeniable and absolute. Lorna, you walked in tonight expecting to find me here. You thought everything would be just as it always was, like yesterday, like last week, like the past 6 years. But it's not. It never will be again. I know where you were. I know who you were with. I know exactly what happened. And because of that, this is no longer your home. The message wasn't complicated. It wasn't cruel. But it was final. I had ensured everything was set just the way I needed it to be. As she read the letter, I could almost picture how her expression shifted. Maybe it began with a hint of confusion, her mind scrambling for rationalizations before the weight of the truth truly hit her. Then came the realization, the creeping panic that this wasn't some cruel joke, and that I wasn't playing along with whatever distorted story she'd try to twist. I wasn't there to confront her. I hadn't come to listen to her version of events. I was simply gone. And with me, everything she thought she could count on had disappeared. Her suitcases were already positioned by the front door, not packed by me. I wasn't feeling that generous, but I had at least placed them there as a quiet nudge that maybe it was time she used them. Her closet stood half empty. The drawers once filled with our shared history, photos, handwritten letters, the little notes we used to leave for one another, had all been cleared out. It wasn't an act of rage. There was no chaos. Just a clean, deliberate removal, as if none of it had ever existed. She remained in that room for quite a while. I knew because I was watching it all unfold on the security camera from my car parked a few houses down. I waited, silent, watching her stand frozen in a bedroom that no longer felt like hers. She clutched the letter that left no ambiguity. The life we had built together was broken beyond any hope of repair. She turned, scanning the room, perhaps searching for proof that it was all some elaborate mistake. Maybe she thought I'd burst through the door, ready to fight for us. But that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't coming back. I had given her everything, my trust, my time, all the late nights where I held her through storms of uncertainty, and every moment I spent constructing a future around us with unwavering belief. And how had she repaid that? By slowly unraveling it, secret by secret, lie by lie. When she dropped to her knees, the thud echoed through the empty house. That was enough for me. I shut off the feed, took one deep breath, and drove away for good. She could keep the house. It no longer belonged to me in any meaningful way. Lorna remained on the bedroom floor, still clutching the letter in her trembling hands. She hadn't started crying yet. That would come later, once the full reality had time to settle in. For now, she was suspended in disbelief, her thoughts racing to find any thread of explanation, any way to undo what had been done. But this wasn't something that could be undone. Still, she wasn't ready to accept that. People like Lorna never saw consequences until they were unavoidably in front of them. I imagined her glancing around, eyes darting toward the vacant spots where my belongings once were, the empty wristwatch tray on the dresser, the gaps in the closet, the shelf stripped of our framed pictures. It would all sink in now. Every missing piece pressing down on her like the closing grip of inevitability. I could see her scrambling upright, phone in hand, already dialing, already rehearsing whatever she thought might draw me back in. Would she open with denial, feign complete ignorance, insist this was all just a huge misunderstanding? Or would she skip straight to the part where she begged for forgiveness, claimed it was a one-time mistake, that it meant nothing and shouldn't destroy everything we had? I wouldn't hear any of it. Her number was already blocked. So by the time she pressed call and was met with the robotic message informing her the number was no longer in service, the panic would really begin to settle. Her hands would fumble, trying again, and again, and again. Blocked. Panic would morph into frustration. She'd rush from the bedroom, maybe race down the stairs, expecting to find me waiting somewhere in the house, ready for a dramatic confrontation. But I wouldn't be there. All that remained were the final signs of my departure, the missing photographs from the walls, the vacant space where my shoes once sat neatly by the front door, and the note I had left on the kitchen counter, resting beside the apartment keys I no longer needed. I could almost hear her breath catch when she saw it. A single sentence. You don't get to rewrite this story. That was all I had left to offer. She could tell her version of what happened to anyone willing to listen, her friends, her family. She could make herself the victim, spin it as if I'd left for no reason, claim she never saw it coming. But we both knew the truth. And now, she was the only one left to face it. I couldn't help but wonder what her next move would be. Would she scream in frustration? Collapse under the weight of the silence that filled the home? Or would she resort to her usual defense mechanism, shifting the blame? Maybe she'd call the same friends who had egged her on while she danced in another man's arms, looking to them for advice. Perhaps they'd assure her that it wasn't a big deal, that I was being overly dramatic, and that I'd eventually calm down and return. That was the lie she'd want to believe. That none of this was real, that it wasn't permanent. But the truth? I had already left. Not just the house. I had walked away from her. From the version of myself that once believed she was worth it. For the first time in what felt like forever, a sense of liberation washed over me. Back at the house, Morna paced the living room, clutching her phone as if it still held hope. The screen was now dark, the last unsuccessful call etched in her call log. She had tried every number she could think of, mine, my family's, even a few old friends who used to like her. But none of them responded. Only silence greeted her attempts, and that silence was starting to close in, choking her with every passing second. She kept turning in anxious circles, her eyes darting around the room like the walls themselves might hold an answer. As though, if she searched hard enough, the missing piece would appear and unravel this nightmare. Everything was physically the same. The couch still sat in its place. The fridge still had leftovers. The lights still flickered when strong wind rattled the windows. But emotionally, it felt like everything had vanished. Deep down, she knew the reason. I was gone. She wandered toward the bedroom again, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the doorframe for support. Her eyes locked on the note I had left on the kitchen counter. It hadn't moved. It stayed right there, mocking her with its stillness. The handwriting was neat, almost too deliberate. There was no sign of haste, no trembling lines, just steady strokes forming the words that shattered her reality. You don't get to rewrite this story. The meaning of that sentence weighed heavily on her, like a rock lodged in her chest. She wanted to scream, to rip the note apart, toss it in the garbage, and pretend none of it meant a thing. But she couldn't, because it meant everything. For the very first time, she was no longer in charge of the story. She had built her life on manipulating situations, twisting perspectives, reshaping truths so she always looked like the innocent one, the victim. She had turned it into a craft, refined it through years of practice. It had saved her more than once. But this time, there was no spinning the truth. No one left to manipulate. I was gone, and all she had left was her own reflection. She collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her fingers digging into the sheets, the same sheets we once laid on, whispering dreams about a future that now felt like fiction. The weight of everything came crashing down on her. She had believed she had time, that she could chase temporary highs and it would never cost her anything real. But it had. Now, the silence she used to ignore had become her constant companion. For what felt like hours, she just sat there, surrounded by darkness, bound by the cold grip of reality. I could almost picture her staring at the ceiling, cycling through every memory, desperate to pinpoint the exact moment I slipped away. But the truth? She had lost me long before this night. She just never noticed, until it was far too late. Morna had always excelled at pretending. She could flash a smile through discomfort, laugh when she didn't mean it, and bend reality just enough to convince herself everything was okay, even when it clearly wasn't. But now, there was no mask to wear. She was entirely alone. For the first time in years, she had no cushion to soften the fall. No escape plan waiting in the shadows. No hidden safety net. She had convinced herself she could balance it all. Reckless indulgences, the warmth of my loyalty, and the false security of trust she had never truly earned. But now, she was left in the ruins of her own choices, staring at the spaces I once filled. The house had grown, wider, emptier. Shadows stretched longer across the walls, curling around familiar objects like ghosts of what used to be. I found myself wondering how long she would stay there, clinging to the letter like it held the power to undo her mistakes. Would she read it again, hoping to find ambiguity? Would she scan each word, searching for any sign of hesitation? Anything to prove I hadn't meant it? She would find none, because every word was deliberate. She could call me 1,000 more times. I would not pick up. She could break things, weep, plead. It wouldn't change anything. I wasn't coming back. I had loved her once, deeply, more than I had ever loved anyone. But love can't survive betrayal. Now, she was left alone with the echoes of all she had thrown away. And that was the consequence she would have to face. Every single day, the road stretched ahead of me and listened open. The night air felt crisp against my skin as I rolled the window down, breathing in the kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The city lights faded in my rearview mirror, growing smaller and smaller until they were nothing but distant memories. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't running from something. I was heading towards something new. Morna's chapter in my life was closed, sealed, irrevocable. She could scream, cry, rewrite the story in her head however she wanted. But the truth remained. She had made her choices. And so had I. The weight that had been pressing down on my chest for months, maybe years, was gone. The pain of betrayal, the anger, the sadness. With every mile I drove away from that house, it felt like pieces of my past were falling away. That place no longer held me captive, and the further I got, the lighter I felt. For what felt like forever, I had convinced myself that my joy was inseparably connected to her, that the life we had dreamed up together was the only future I could ever have. But I had been mistaken. True happiness wasn't something left behind. It didn't reside in the person who had once torn me apart. It was out there, somewhere ahead of me, wrapped in the unknown and the dreams I had never allowed myself to dream. I had no clear destination, no detailed plan of what was coming next. But one truth had settled deep within me. I was free now. And for the very first time in my life, that freedom was everything I needed.